Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Live Free, Ride Free. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times bestselling author of The Horse Boy and The Long Ride Home. Before I jump in with today's guest, I want to say a huge thank you to you, our audience, for helping to make this happen. I have a request. If you like what we do here, please give it a thumbs up, like, subscribe, tell a friend. It really, really helps us to make the progress. To find out about our certification courses, online video libraries, books, and other courses, please go to rupertisaacson.com. So now let's jump in. Welcome back to Live Free, Ride Free. I've got Jo Marchant. She's a scientist, she's a best-selling author, she's a journalist, she's someone who presents science to people like me, people like you, entertains us, gets us to understand more, gets us to look at our universe in, let's say, a more considered and way, perhaps with fresher eyes. How'd you get here? What can we learn from her? How do you end up becoming someone who does that kind of thing for a living? Because it sounds pretty cool. So Jo, thanks for coming on the show, and tell us who you are, what you do, and why.
Okay, I normally introduce myself as science journalist and author, so that's what I've spent most of my career doing. So my background is in science. I studied science at university. I have a PhD in genetics, but doing a PhD is tough. I realized quite quickly that lab work as a researcher is not for me. It's a really lonely
How did you
thing.
realize that quickly? Because you did a PhD, it must have taken you like 10 years to
Well, I didn't realize it until I started the PhD, and then quite quickly after starting it, because up to that point you're studying, you're learning. This was fascinating. I remember doing a project as part of my undergraduate degree, and I was working in this genetics lab, and I went to Leicester University where DNA fingerprinting had just been invented, and everything was really exciting. And I did this project in the genetics lab, and I'd isolated some DNA from this particular bacterium and seen that it had this little ring of DNA in its cells, this little plasmid, which was no big deal really, but it was something that I had discovered for the first time. Like, nobody knew that was there until me, and I found that really exciting, the idea that I was able to, in this tiny way, explore nature, explore reality, and find something out for myself. I think that's what's always hooked me about science. So I love the science, but then when I did the PhD, it wasn't quite the same. You have to have a certain mindset, I think, to be a researcher, because it's quite a lonely thing, because you're the only one really who understands your project. You have a supervisor, but you're kind of on your own with it, and it's actually quite tedious. You're setting up these experiments and doing the same repetitive things day in, day out. Most of the time it didn't work. Very occasionally you might get something.
I think they call that rigor, don't they? Yeah.
Yeah, and so I have utmost respect for working researchers, but for me it wasn't the way that I envisaged spending my life. I found that quite difficult. I'd also moved to, so I grew up in Kent, went to university in Leicester, and I started my PhD there, and then moved down to London, so I didn't know anyone either. So it was just a tricky time. So for a while, I really didn't think I was going to get that PhD, but you just do the next day, right? You don't always have to be able to see the end of something. You just have to be able to do one more day. Yeah, eventually I got through it, but I just by chance saw a little advert for this master's course that was running at Imperial College in Science Communication. And I didn't really know what I was going to do at that point, but everything on the syllabus of this course. So they
After you got your PhD or while doing your PhD?
This was while I was still doing my PhD.
So just like everyone, you thought, oh, well, I'm doing this PhD, I might as well do a master's as well, because
Well, I didn't start it until after the PhD. I had to rush to get the write-up done to finish in time. Actually, no, that's not true. There was a bit of an overlap. I was still writing up the PhD when I started the master's, which was a really bad idea. But everything on this that they were going to study on this course, they were doing TV, radio, museum exhibits, websites.
So what was the master's in again?
It was in science communication, which at the time was quite a new thing.
Okay.
And now there's science communication courses everywhere.
Are there?
I had never heard of this thing called science communication at the time, but it just...
How to be David Attenborough, basically. Interesting.
Yeah, like, so you're not actually a working scientist, but you're, you're writing about it, you're talking about it, maybe you're making TV programs, radio programs about it. That just sounded so fun. And then it sort of promised that connection. with people that I was sort of missing. So I went and did that, and so learn all these practical skills that I expected to learn, but it was also really unexpected in that they really hit you with this sort of inquiry of, well, what is science actually? Because I had, my parents came from science backgrounds. I'd studied science at university. I'd done this PhD. I'd never really questioned it. And then they were sort of hitting you with, well, what's the definition of science? How do you even define it? And it's actually really difficult to define.
How do you define it?
Sorry?
How do you define it?
Well, this is something that I'm still working on that question. But when at that point, you try and say, well, it's when you make a hypothesis and then you do an experiment and then you look at the results. But you can always find, in astronomy, for example, and you're, looking at distant stars through a telescope, you're not necessarily making a hypothesis. There's always an example that kind of doesn't quite fit your definition, and there's always examples that you might intuitively say, well, that's not science, that kind of does fit the it's a really
Is science
slippery...
the exploration and the attempt to explain nature?
Yeah, so for me now, it's very much about that interaction with nature. I think it's asking questions of nature and listening to the answers. I think it's probably the best that I've got, not having a sort of preconceived idea about what you're going to find. But there is this other aspect to science as well, which is building up this body of knowledge. You've got to build on all the things that people have done before you. So there's always this tension between, but building on what's gone before and sort of not going outside of those kind of bounds of this understanding that everyone's built up. But then you also need that, that creativity and that openness to what you're finding.
Sounds like law.
Well, maybe I think it's everything, actually. I'm starting to think that everything in life is it's that balance
Building on precedent. Yeah.
between order and chaos, between building on what's gone before and being open to what's new.
Well, isn't it interesting that you started as a geneticist, and it almost is like what you're describing is an ancestral process, which is, one man's ancestors is another man's genetics, right? That what is human life other than stuff that gets passed down generations, and stuff that sort of continues to be useful gets discarded. So it gets kept. Stuff that isn't seems to get discarded, maybe gets rediscovered later, perhaps. But you're right. I think that is the sort of nature of the human condition, really, isn't it? So is science the human interaction with nature and the attempt to explain it? Or
I mean, it's a certain kind of, there's lots of different ways in which humans can interact with nature. And I think at the time I was quite black and white. I was like, well, science is the route to truth. This is how we find our knowledge, and other knowledge is not as impressive as the science knowledge. And that's not at all what I think now.
Okay.
But at the time, being very young and just growing up with science, and they really, in that course, I was very resistant to it at the time. And I used to argue in all of the classes, and I'd be the one going, but what about this? But they were really trying to get us ready to step outside of the world of science and be able to comment on it and communicate it for others. So not to be just sort of PR people for science, but actually to interrogate science and examine it and saying, well, are we asking the right questions? And what I've become more and more interested in is the sort of assumptions and biases that are at the bottom of science. Maybe this is something we'll come back to later, because there's so many unspoken assumptions about what the world is like and what reality is like that science is built on, and some of those I think are quite problematic. And I think I'm starting to realize that when I have a problem with science, it's not the scientific method, it's not the exploration, it's those sort of hidden biases at the bottom of everything.
Can you give me an example of a hidden bias that you've got a problem with?
Well, the biggest one, just to go straight into it now, the biggest one I think is that there is a physical reality out there that is separate from us, that the universe is somehow made of these particles, whatever they are, that have an existence independent of humanity, independent of the observer. I think that's very problematic. We don't actually have any evidence that is the case, but all of Western materialistic science is based on that. Or the idea that the best way to understand something is reductionism, is to split it up into its tiniest parts. And if you understand those tiny parts and how they interact, you will understand the whole. I think not all science is based on that now, but a lot of science is based on this idea. And obviously splitting something into its parts and making it simpler is a good way to understand a lot. But there's so much about the whole and how that comes together and how the whole influences the parts that is missed if you take that approach. So it's kind of those sort of fundamental things about what is reality made of, how does causation work, where we're sort of still stuck in certain ways of thinking that I think are proving not to be that helpful. And it links as well to the split between, or the relationship between mind and body. You know, we're still stuck in this feeling that mind is separate from body somehow.
But yeah, mind is a product of the brain rather than...
Yeah, that you've got the physical brain and that mind somehow, I don't know, sort of emerges from it, but can't really do anything because everything is determined by your neurons firing and the atoms that make up the neurons, which are in turn determined by the laws.
Do you feel more that mind is something that exists like consciousness and we emerge from it? So our mind is experiencing mind and our bodies truck us around within mind, but mind is where we are. And conscious universe, sort of Rupert Sheldrake type way of looking at things, or do you see it differently?
Yeah, I struggle a bit with Rupert Sheldrake, and it's so difficult. Sorry,
That was a good visual. I saw you guys locked in combat there for a moment.
Yeah, this is something. So jumping ahead, but so one of the books that I wrote, Cure: A Journey into the Science of Mind Over Body, I was really interested in these examples of when what's going on in your mind, your expectations, your beliefs, clearly are affecting the physical body, are affecting physical health, which from a sort of conventional perspective shouldn't really be happening. And so the everything from hypnosis to mindfulness to placebo effect to religious belief. So that book was really sort of exploring.
Let's just have the title of that book again for the listeners who maybe missed it.
Yeah, it's called Cure: A Journey into the Science of Mind Over Body.
Cure: A Journey into the Science of Mind Over Body.
And I do have problems with that subtitle now because I don't think mind over body is the best way to put it. But, the publishers wanted something that you could immediately understand.
And no one remembers subtitles anyway, to be perfect.
Yeah, exactly. So Cure, basically. Yeah. They were into one-word titles at the time. And since I wrote that, I've been, convinced by this idea that, you hear in Eastern philosophies all the time that there is no split between mind and body. Mind and body are one. And, that was 10 years ago, that book. And I didn't know how to imagine it, because you brought up, well, I was anyway, with this idea of there's this physical world and there's my desk and my computer and all these atoms and there's my body. And then there's my sort of mind and my experience. And they seem like completely different things. They're not even made of, you can't describe them both using the same rules. They're not made of the same stuff. And yet how could they be one? And what's really interested me ever since then is trying to understand what that means, to see the reality with mind and body being...
In Cure, what conclusion did you come to with that?
In Cure, I didn't really. Where I got to at the end of Cure was looking at all of the scientific research, because I wanted to take an evidence-based approach to this, because I wanted, looking at the science of how do emotions, beliefs, all of this affect the physical body. And so where I got to the end of that is the mind is so important in how the physical body is doing. Like you can't have a medicine that treats us as physical bodies. It matters for everything from the pain that you feel to recovery rates from cancer. It's just you can't separate the two in terms of outcomes. But in terms of the sort of philosophy, but what does that actually mean? That book wasn't enough to sort of complete that journey, if you like. Well,
here's an interesting thought. It's a fascinating topic. I remember once being on a mountain I was on Table Mountain in Cape Town. I was about 25 years old and I had a raging fever. So I had mild delirium. So I got a sort of epiphany while I was up there. And I remembered this thing that had been on the school chapel wall: God is love, love is God. And I remember always thinking, yeah, that's true. I can't say why that's true, but that feels true to me. And for some reason, that thought came up while I was on Table Mountain. And I thought, well, if God is love and I was God and everything is God, then everything must be love, which means that matter must be God, which means that matter must be love, which means that the t-shirt that I'm wearing, which is made of cotton, which is made of, or if it's a synthetic one, which is made of old forests, is matter. So therefore it's love. And even the car that I'm going down to, which is made of metal, and the fuel that's in it and so on, and the plastic of the seat, it's all going back to these ancient forests, which must be composed of matter, which are composed of love, which blah, 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 blah. And it sort of went, yes, that makes perfect sense to me. Irrational moment, but nonetheless it felt completely rational. So that is that
I love that.
mind operating somewhat almost independently, and then perhaps me being able to set the fever takes my ego, my sense of self, a little bit to the side, and now suddenly I'm accessing mind, and then a bit later the ego comes back in and blocks it again. Like, what do you think of those sorts of experiences? You must have, examined them a bit in your book, Cure.
Yeah, I mean that's really, I love that story. It's really interesting. I mean, it is that sort of that classic, psychedelic or transcendental or spiritual, ecstatic, whatever you want to call it, experience. And that so often people say everything is love, everything is God. That's the if you take everything else away,
Right. And the reason I thought of that was you saying, or your view had been, well, here I am sitting at my desk and this is the computer and the chair are not me, and how, therefore I'm separate from them. So how can it all be one whole? And me thinking, well, if it's all matter and matter is all love, then it is all one whole with just different products of it. But of course I can't
yeah, well, it's
scientifically. Yeah.
yeah, and I didn't look into it so much in Cure, but then my next book, The Human Cosmos, was a story of the universe, but through our relationship with it. So that was the story of how people have sort of connected with the stars and the sky, starting with the Paleolithic and coming all the way through to the present day. And so trying to understand what would that original relationship with the sky, with the universe, with reality have been. And they lived in a subjective world. It was this sort of, they didn't separate themselves from the earth, from nature, from the sky. They didn't separate the earth from the sky. It was this sort of holistic, as far as we can know, and that's from looking at things like cave paintings and archaeology, and from hunter-gatherer groups living more recently. So just putting all of the clues together of what kind of world would they have had. It's this, the stars in the sky are changing through the seasons as nature is changing on the earth, as humans, and everything is sort of interacting, and you've just got one system that's changing. And so the story in that book is, how did we separate ourselves? How did we step away from nature and start to sort of see ourselves, and how did we separate sort of the mind from matter, and how did we build this objective scientific view?
So how did we?
Huh?
So how did we?
Well, step by step is the answer. I mean, I don't know how
What
much
are the
we
main
want to go
steps
through.
of that separation, though?
No, but I think the first step would have been in the Neolithic Revolution and the invention of farming, and
I would agree. Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse comes straight out of the plow. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about it is that for a long time, academics thought that farming happened for whatever reason, environmental or, pressures, they needed more food. And then there was this sort of philosophical shift of like, we know humans are dominant over nature. But actually, one of the chapters in the book is about this site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, which dates from like the 10th millennium BC, kind of halfway between Lascaux Cave and the pyramids and Stonehenge. And it happens just before the birth of farming, and exactly when farming was about to arrive, like in the place where farming was about to happen, but just before. And you've got these huge stone structures, these stone circles all carved just before, and that wasn't meant to have happened, because it should have been farming. And then people thought, yeah, then we got this philosophical shift, and then we see all the stone circles and everything. But this kind of it was like out of time. It's in the wrong order in history. And
now they found an even older one, not far from Göbekli Tepe, which seems to be a couple of thousand, possibly even more before that. So it seems the timeline keeps getting
smaller
shifted
ones,
back.
definitely a bit. Yeah. So yeah, and so what the archaeologists think is actually you had this shift in mindset in people's relationship to nature and to the sky that happened first. And Göbekli Tepe, they think that the circles were actually simulating the underworld. They would have been covered over, and you had to crawl in through a little porthole. And then they have these. They have found the remains of lots of human skulls that were hung up inside, and these
Always
pillars seem
cheerful.
to
Yeah.
represent these sort of transcendental figures. And so it would have been going into this dark underworld. But anyway, the sort of upshot of it all is they think that there was this sort of, you don't have the animal paintings like you do, say, in Lascaux Cave. It's now
But
all
you
about
do have a
these
lot of animal
dominant.
carvings in there, right? There
Yeah,
are
there's some little animals,
carvings
but
on this bill.
these dominant human stone figures that they think represent human ancestors. So it's no longer seeing animals in the sky and covering your caves with animal paintings. This is like humans are dominant, and it's the human underworld and human.
Or are they
ancestors.
aliens?
Huh?
Or are they aliens?
Well, I mean, I'm sure there's all kinds of different possible explanations, but they're wearing these pendants are really interesting because they're flat, T-shaped, giant.
Absolutely.
But they have necklaces, loincloths. They've got a lot of human features on them. But what seems to have happened is you had this shift in mindset where people started seeing themselves as separate from and dominant over the rest of nature, and then you get agriculture. So it was kind of that step away that happened first, and then just step by step. You've got the Babylonians, who are the first. They're sort of looking to the sky, and they were the first to use sort of mathematics and numbers to model the movements of celestial bodies in the heavens.
More so than the Sumerians, would you say, who came before
In
them? But
terms
you
of what
believe
they
that
could do with the mathematical astronomy, yes. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I'm not.
Can you make that clear for us? Because that's quite interesting. So, for a lot of us who grew up with the sort of standard historical timeline, people told us civilization starts with Sumeria, and our math and stuff like that comes from there. So what is the difference between the Sumerian and the Babylonian coming a little bit later, more or less the same place?
Well, so you've got the invention of writing, obviously, and mathematics that they're using for a lot of economic purposes. So, taxes and things like that.
But aren't the Sumerians doing that too?
Yeah. Sorry, this is the Sumerians.
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, and obviously they were also really interested in the sky, but it's what the Babylonians just took it to another level.
Okay.
In terms of they are looking to the sky, and because, well, basically so they've got these omens, they saw omens and everything that happened around them. And, if a bird came into your house and you were the only one that saw it, that would be some omen for you personally. But the things in the sky were visible to everybody, and therefore these were omens that affected the entire nation and the king. And so something like a lunar eclipse might mean the death of the king, because of the blood red color of it. So they were really concerned with this. And so the king or ruler would have teams of astronomers who were watching the sky every day, writing down in these diaries exactly everything that happened to try and predict what was coming next. And they've got these omens. But because they did that, so that what they did that was different was because they were keeping those records every night over centuries, they started to see these mathematical patterns in how the celestial bodies were repeating themselves in the sky. So, I mean, it was fairly obvious, that you've got the sun's position moves through the year and the moon's phases are shifting through the month. But they started to see things like, the patterns in the planets, like Venus. So the planets seem as if they're kind of wandering around all over the place. But after sort of different numbers of years, those planetary cycles will repeat. Patterns of eclipses as well. After 18 years, I think it is, those patterns will repeat. So they're able to see those patterns. They called them great cycles. And then they were able to use arithmetic techniques to compute the motion of these bodies through the sky really quite accurately. They used very sophisticated mathematics to do this so that they could compute in advance where different things were going to be in the sky on different dates. So they always didn't need to watch because they knew what was going to happen. So I think that was the thing that I think was so impressive that they did. They're now using mathematics to kind of model what's happening in the sky and predict what's going to happen in the sky in advance in a way that had never been done before.
Effectively computing, yeah.
And for me, that's interesting because you're moving then from a sort of qualitative experience of your universe to a quantitative one. It's no longer, they always had a very magical view, but it's no longer just this subjective, your human experience of what's happening. That they're switching to this sort of mathematical universe, which is really what science has been built on. So anyway, you can follow these sort of steps. Once you start to look at the universe mathematically, then people started to look at time mathematically, and we start counting hours and minutes and seconds, and we start to think about time as this abstract thing that ticks by, rather than just seeing change, our experience of change, which is how a lot of traditional societies would still see it. You start to see space mathematically, you're no longer just experiencing where you go in the world, but you're imagining this abstract space that you can map. And that was a new thing. So we start to see everything in the universe as this sort of abstract mathematical terrain,
matrix,
which has been really powerful. But my argument in that book is that it's, at the same time, we've kind of then forgotten about the importance of our own experience of the sky. If you think about everything in an abstract, rational way, you're learning so much about the universe, but you're also missing so much. Anyone who's looked up at the sky and just been absolutely awestruck and had an experience maybe a bit like the one that you had when you had the fever, that's it's telling you something really important.
Yes, no, I agree. I mean, I think what you're touching on is that one can't separate the rational from the irrational, because life is always 50-50, right? So you can be a scientist and you can explain a few things quite a lot. You as a geneticist, I'm sure, can explain a lot, but I'm sure you've fallen in love, and it would be very difficult to actually fully pinpoint. You could say, well, it's this hormone and that hormone, it gets triggered by this. But even so, that's not the full picture. I remember this emotional experience that we have is as important as the quantitative, I suppose. But the quantitative helps us to make sense sometimes of our emotional universe as well. But one just can never separate the two. I remember my uncle, Dr. Peter Isaacson, who was an eminent pathologist at UCL, University College Hospital, UCH rather, and in London. And he still is a man who doesn't hesitate to tell you if he thinks you're full of poo, and will take some pleasure in telling you that you're full of poo. And when I came back from the journey that I did with my autistic son across Mongolia, where we were going from shaman to shaman, and we made a movie about it and we wrote a book about it, and we did a little private screening for the family, and he was there. And I expected him to take a massive shit all over me. So at the end of the screening, I just opened this imaginary umbrella and I went up to him and said, all right, Peter, take a shit, fair game, surf's up, take a shot. And he said, actually, this time I'm not going to, Rupert. I said, well, why? It's unlike you, pass up that opportunity. And he said, well, because two things. Remember, this is about 20 years ago now. He said, well, A, you're saying something about autism that maybe it's actually not necessarily a bad thing. This is quite interesting. He said, the other thing you're doing is you're touching on the placebo effect. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, most people misunderstand the placebo effect, Rupert. He said, most people would dismiss something as the placebo effect. He said, what they don't understand is that the placebo effect is what modern scientific medicine, Western medicine, rests upon. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when a drug comes on the market, after it goes through its research thing, it must go through a trial. And in that trial, some of the control groups get a placebo. And the drug has to make more people better than the placebo. And this often takes several rounds. Often, for quite a few rounds, a lot more people get better on the placebo than get better on the drug. And they don't just think they get better and die later. They actually get better. And we don't know why. So you think, Rupert, that when you get this prescription, that it's all entirely rational because it's all come out of laboratories and so on. But actually, it's based upon something very irrational. And it's this balance between the two that is medicine. And that was really interesting of him to say. But I think
I think the
something
placebo
similar.
effect is it's another really good example, actually, of why we need both things, and how sometimes the rational has ended up pushing out the irrational, or the two have become separated. Because everything you said about the trials and everything, that's absolutely true. So medicine knows about placebo effects and knows how powerful they are, and that's why they have to go to such great lengths to kind of do these trials to show that the drug is better than the placebo. But then the trials are completely designed around cancelling out the placebo effect, if you like, so that we can see the drug effect, which you need to.
We'll say superseding. Yes.
But then in terms of then how we treat patients, we're just treating them with the drugs. There's this great effort gone to let's make sure that the placebo effect has nothing to do with it, and we're not using that, and we're just going to get rid of that. And anything that doesn't work better than
that's for little girls. Yeah, absolutely.
Or anything that can't be placebo is out. even if, say with acupuncture, for example, for pain, actually there are some trials where acupuncture is better than fake acupuncture, but there's a lot of trials as well where it's about the same, but even the placebo acupuncture is way better than the drugs for chronic pain. So you're throwing out something that works better than the drugs just because of the nature of it. And I think that was a lot of the argument in Cure, was just that this is madness. You know, we should be looking at we should be thinking, wow, why is this working? How is this working? How can we
How can we harness it?
Huh?
How can we harness it?
Yeah, exactly. And there are some, you know, I spoke to some really fascinating researchers who were trying to do that in different ways, but so many of them said that they were struggling for funding, couldn't get taken seriously.
Well, because the pharmaceutical industry has no skin in that game, right? Why would they fund?
I mean, it's massive. There's sort of philosophical obstacles in it because there's this sort of idea that, well, it can't be real if it's just to do with the mind. But yeah, absolutely the economic arguments as well, because the drug companies are the ones doing the vast majority of the clinical trials. So why are they going to test anything? And also how they, you know, how do you make money out of these, you know, out of care, essentially? What they're saying is, if you care for people and you treat them as human beings, they do so much better in absolutely, you know, from birth until death, everything that you can think of. It matters so much.
The mammalian caregiving system, absolutely.
Yeah.
Tell us, can you give us a couple of examples of researchers that you think we should look at who are looking at this though?
Oh, well, I think that Ted Kaptchuk is really interesting at Harvard.
How do you spell?
So Ted, and then Kaptchuk. I think I've got that right.
With a T, Ted Kaptchuk.
Kaptchuk, yeah.
Harvard. Okay, tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, so I've actually got an interview with him on my podcast where the Wild Thoughts are, let me think, week after next coming up. And I just thought he was fascinating.
Yeah, that's Where the Wild Thoughts Are.
Where the Wild Thoughts
Listen to Joe's podcast.
So that's all about how can we see the world differently. I think I've always been fascinated by wanting to see the world in a different way. It's almost like, you know, a different kind of travel, if you like. I think that's why I've been so fascinated by, I really want to understand what it feels like to see mind and body as the same thing, and why I'm fascinated by history and archaeology, because, you know, people in the past have seen the world in such different ways. And, you know, every time you can understand a completely alien way of seeing the world, it tells you something about your own, obviously.
100%.
So anyway,
so tell us what if you were to summarize what he's up to.
He's a really interesting guy. So he started off in the 60s. He went to China to study traditional Chinese medicine, and he became one of the first Westerners to become qualified in that over there. Came back, had a practice, realized that his patients were getting better, but it wasn't anything to do with what he was doing. He was saying that, you know, they'd come and see him, he'd write the prescription, he hadn't even given them any treatment yet, and they would walk out feeling better. And he was like, there's something going on here, and it's not the treatment that I'm giving them. And he ended up getting taken on by Harvard, because at the time there was some funding for alternative medicine, and he was supposed to be researching alternative medicine. And he said, actually, what I think I need to be researching is the placebo effect. Okay. So he has pioneered trials of the placebo effect. So rather than just testing drug against placebo, he might do a trial where he gives everybody placebo, but he's testing. So he did one with fake acupuncture, placebo acupuncture, for example. So you'd have one group who got no treatment, and then you'd have one group who got fake acupuncture, but from a very sort of cold but polite practitioner, doesn't really talk to you, just does the thing with the needles. And then there'd be another group who got the acupuncture from a warm, empathic practitioner who's taking the time, who's asking them questions. And so trying to separate out the placebo effect into these different components, and you can see like a dose response effect where, you know, the ones who get no treatment, even just being in the trial, they're a bit better, you know, there's an improvement. But then the people who get the thing with the needles, but the cold practitioner, they improve a bit more. But the people who get the needles and the warm care improve the most. This was a trial in irritable bowel syndrome, I think, and they actually improve more than you would ever see normally with drugs. So it's just, he's just got this really curious mind, and he thinks differently, and he's really trying to get at what matters. And he also pioneered trials in honest placebos. So this is where you give people a placebo, but you tell them it's a placebo. And everyone had said, well, isn't going to work. And part of the reason, one of the rationales for not using placebos in medicine was you've got to lie to people and tell them that they're really getting a proper medicine, and you can't do that because it isn't ethical. So therefore, much as we'd love to use placebos, we can't. And he's like, okay, let's tell people, and found that it still worked. And he still got this really significant improvement.
That would make perfect sense to me. Again, having spent so much time, so I lived on and off for years in the Kalahari with hunter-gatherers. And so I've witnessed more shamanic healings than I can possibly count. And I've seen people just consistently be sick and get better, sick and get better. And to the point where you realize these people have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. So if it was all bollocks, they'd all be dead, right? Because they all get sick and they'd all die, but they don't. So, okay. But what you're noticing is that it's always done very lovingly. And sometimes an actual plant is given, like this plant does actually affect, your blood in this way, and actually there's a pharmaceutical company trying to patent it, Okay, so there are pharmaceuticals involved. But when it's just purely trance healing or faith healing or shamanism, whatever you want to call it, the effects are often greater. And, of really, really serious conditions, cancers and that sort of thing, and also psychosis. What seems often to help is people will be given a conscious placebo, like an amulet or a special stone or an animal bone or something that's representative of some aspect of the healing. It could be you're going to destroy this thing and destroy the sickness, or you're going to keep this thing and invite in the healing or whatever. But it seems to work really consistently. People get sick and get better. So I love that he's doing this work on conscious placebo, because that seems to have actually been an ancient human technology that has worked quite efficiently for a long time. It would be interesting to see why. And back to my uncle Peter, what he said was also in that conversation some years ago, well, one of these days science will look at this shamanic thing and probably will be able to see if it's somehow kickstarting the immune system, if it's somehow kickstarting the endocrine system and affecting psychosis and that sort of thing. But we're just not there yet. So it's interesting that you're talking about this guy who clearly is doing it.
Yeah, there's a lot of so it's interesting you talk about the amulets and everything, because there's another guy, Dan Moorman, who studies placebo effects, and he thinks that we should rename it the meaning response. And it hasn't caught on.
Interesting.
But I think that it would be a great name. Because
tell us his name again.
Dan Moorman, Moerman. So he's more on the anthropology side.
Okay.
But it's just the importance of meaning, really. Meaning, purpose. If something means something to you, and so that's what placebos are. It's the meaning of the treatment.
Right. Again, it comes to emotion, doesn't it? You can't separate emotion from physiology, presumably.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's coming back to that tension that we talked about at the beginning. It's really easy to kind of go one way and say, we just need physical drugs and surgery, and this whole thing about healing thoughts is just ridiculous. And then other people will go to the other extreme and say Western medicine's terrible, and we just will need to just use our minds to heal ourselves, and we can get rid of all the pills. And I think the hard thing sometimes is to hold both of those things at the same time, and to realize that we need both, but to use each one, to use the strengths of each one, because there are some things like chronic pain and a lot of mental illness, and there's this a lot of chronic problems, chronic gut problems, fatigue, a lot of these things that
inflammation stuff. Yeah.
Right?
Inflammation stuff.
A lot of that you can sort of get at in different ways, but there are a lot of things where we do not have good drugs to treat them, like say chronic pain as an example. We don't have good drugs for chronic pain, and
I see where you're coming from.
Often do more harm than good.
Yeah.
So you're treating if you're giving people drugs, you're just treating the wrong thing, because that's not. Chronic pain is often not caused by a specific physical problem in the body, and so you need a more holistic approach. There are other things like, infections like measles or something, or bacterial infection, where vaccines or antibiotics are absolutely the way to go. You still need care with that, But so I think there's a kind of a spectrum. You always need both, but there's sort of a balance
Exactly. You would
changes. So I
hope that
don't,
the person administering your vaccine or your antibiotic would still have a good bedside manner, right?
yeah, and you need to treat, if there's a baby that's ill, you need to be thinking about the whole family, for example. So it's not going to be as simple as just saying we either need the pills, or oh no, we don't need the pills. We need to worry about is the mind. It's we always need to bring the two things together. And I think Western medicine has gone way too far in one direction, but I think also there can be a backlash against that, and for understandable reasons, but that can perhaps tip too far the other way when people are sort of reacting against vaccines, for example.
Oh,
or saying-
100%. But that's just so much our separatist type culture, isn't it? As you said before, to swing from one extreme to the other. Very interestingly, for example, these healers that I would know in the Kalahari, they wouldn't hesitate to use Western medicine, because they'd often say, well, look, I've got to go into trance and dance for 12 hours because there's no psychotropic drug that grows in the Kalahari. There's no ayahuasca, nothing like that. So if I want to access this altered state of consciousness, I've got to work really, really hard. If I could go and get a pill that does the job, absolutely, I'm going to go do that. But I might live 5 days walk from any kind of Western medicine. And then in that case, I need to fall back on my traditional practice. But being a rational human being, this is them talking, I'm going to use both. Why do you Westerners have such an issue with that? Surely that's the rational way, right? Hedge your bet.
Well, in China, where they have traditional Chinese medicine, but and people would go to that, a healer for lots of things. But if you've broken your leg or had a heart attack or something, or you've
Yes.
got a bad bacterial infection, they're not going to the traditional healer. They're going to go to the medical hospital. So it's realizing kind of what works in different situations. And I'm interested in the researchers who are able to do that. So another guy that I think is really interesting is called Manfred Shedlowski. Sorry, all the surnames.
We'd be disappointed if they were,
Yeah, so he's in
mixed, wouldn't we?
Germany.
Yeah.
Schedlowski, Shedlowski. And they are looking at conditioning, like training the immune system to respond to taste and smell. So I don't know if you're familiar with, say, Pavlovian conditioning, with Pavlov's dogs, and you ring the bell when you give them the food, and then they associate the bell with the food, so they start salivating even when you just ring the bell and there's no food. It's as kind of, you can train sort of a psychological cue to trigger a physiological response.
Sure, it's like me with beer. Right, absolutely.
As you know, if you followed any of my work, I'm an autism dad, and we have a whole career before this podcast in helping people with neurodivergence, either who are professionals in the field. Are you a therapist? Are you a caregiver? Are you a parent? Or are you somebody with neurodivergence? When my son Rowan was diagnosed with autism in 2004, I really didn't know what to do. So I reached out for mentorship, and I found it through an amazing adult autistic woman who's very famous, Dr. Temple Grandin. And she told me what to do. And it's been working so amazingly for the last 20 years that not only is my son basically independent, but we've helped countless thousands of others reach the same goal, working in schools, working at home, working in therapy settings. If you would like to learn this cutting-edge neuroscience-backed approach, it's called Movement Method. You can learn it online. You can learn it very, very simply. It's almost laughably simple. The important thing is to begin. Let yourself be mentored, as I was, by Dr. Grandin, and see what results can follow. Go to this website, newtrailslearning.com. Sign up as a gold member. Take the online Movement Method course. It's in 40 countries. Let us know how it goes for you. We really want to know. We really want to help people like me, people like you out there live their best life, to live free, ride free, see what happens.
Yeah, so often when I'm giving talks, I might show a picture of this slices of lemon and say, just imagine, visualize that you are eating this lemon and you're biting into it and you're sucking down the juice. And
I can feel the bitter right in my
for people who've had lemons before, you feel this tingling.
Yeah.
which is your salivary glands switching on.
Mhm.
I could not, that is not under conscious control. I could not say to you, just switch on your salivary glands, please.
Absolutely.
No, but by talking to you
But
and
you just
creating
did.
an image,
Mm.
this physiological response has happened, and that works for all different kinds of physical systems through our body, including the immune system. So you can train the immune system. And so what he's doing is, for the trials, he created this green drink. There was a mixture of strawberry milk, lavender oil, and green food coloring. So he's looking for, I mean, I've tasted it. It's like nothing you've had before, because it's like, it's sweet and it looks green, but it tastes purple because of the lavender, and it's bitter and it's oily, and it's just weird, hits you, all of your senses. And so that was the aim of it. And so he's doing trials with kidney transplant patients who have to take drugs to suppress their immune systems every day so they don't reject the kidney. But those immunosuppressant drugs have horrible side effects. As many people die from the drugs as die from rejecting the kidney. So he gives people this green drink, and at the same time as drinking it, they take their immunosuppressant drug. And you do that a few times so that the body or brain, whatever, learns the association. And then the drink on its own will suppress the immune system in the same way that the drug did, because the body's learned. And so you're using a psychological or sort of sensory cue to have that effect. And often that will last for a bit, but then it might sort of fade over time. But if you give them people a very tiny dose of the drug with the drink, so much smaller than you would have needed before to have a clinical response, you can keep that suppression going. So it's just incorporating the mind and the senses into medicine to massively reduce the dose of a drug that's causing these harmful side effects. So it's not throwing the drugs out, but we can be much cleverer about how we use the mind and the body together. And he struggles for funding. Drug companies don't really take this seriously, but I just think that could be, if we took those kinds of approaches as seriously, if you put as much money into those as goes into, developing conventional drugs, you could hugely transform medicine. So yeah, there's another example.
So let's talk about you a bit. So how do you become you? I think there's a lot of people out there who would love to have this kind of journalistic presentation of interesting stuff to the world. Now, I know that you went and did this MA in sort of how to do that with science, but going and taking a college course is obviously not going to do that. And I've been a freelance journalist for 5,000 years or so, so I know that it's a little easier now with social media. You can create YouTube channels and podcasts and things. And in the old days, it was much more gatekeepers, if an editor would take you on or not. But nonetheless, you've still got to, there's a certain kind of perseverance and also savvy about how to present yourself as someone that can present things. So for every person who's listening to this right now or watching this, who's just wants to know, interesting stuff that Joe Marchant is up to and wants to read about it and hear from you, there's also with that a parallel population who would like to be you. How does somebody become you? Go into your own psychology, because you could have just taken that course, that MA, and tried a bit, and London is a hard city to live in. I grew up there. It's expensive. It's very competitive. You're always meeting people who are like 50 bazillion times more successful than you. It's exhausting because it's so big, and it can be quite demoralizing to try to get going in a sort of media career there, particularly if you're not, reporting on what Prince Harry did. So talk us through your biography a bit. How'd you get to do this successfully? It's intriguing.
Yeah, I think, as you say, it has changed quite a lot, because I did my MSc in 2000. Oh my God, 25 years ago.
So when you were 2, basically, right?
Yeah. And yeah, it was much more like the traditional publishers had it a lot more nailed down. So you kind of had to go through that route. It would have been very difficult just to start doing stuff. And I think that's really changed now. And that's really exciting now, that the avenues there are to just start creating. And yeah, so I think I've never had a plan which I used to think was a bad thing. And now I'm going to sort of see it more as a kind of a strength, in that I've never really known where I'm going, but when a door opens, you get this feeling of, yes, I'm going through that. And I don't really question it too much. So I didn't know that I wanted to be a journalist. I didn't know that I wanted to write books, but every sort of every kind of turn I've taken has sort of been a bit of a surprise to me. But looking back, it feels as if there was a plan, because I think you just have this instinctive feeling of, this is what I want to do. I have to say yes to this, and you just.
Well, you've just put your finger there on that rational thing. So you said, I have this feeling. Where's that feeling come from? Describe how that feeling arises in your body, and why do you know that that's the feeling to say yes to? Because not everyone is so in touch with their intuition. And you probably weren't trained to be in touch with your intuition because of the scientific background of your parents, or were you? Were they actually quite holistic that way?
No, not particularly. No, it wasn't, there wasn't a lot of sort of touchy-feely, let's talk about our emotions, or any of that at all. But I think what my parents did give me was this sort of safety and security, like a secure base and a feeling that everything is going to be okay, and that there's always a kind of base to come home to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's been hugely helpful to me, and it's something that I think about a lot in terms of bringing my kids up now. That's the feeling that I want to give them, because I think then it gives you that courage. Like I don't tend to spend a lot of time agonizing about things, or making lists of, should I do this or should I do that, which can be bad sometimes for, like, impulse buys or something. But it's just it's not even in my. It's not a rational thought thing. It's more. I'm pointing to my body, but it's more like just a feeling.
Well, I noticed that where you're pointing to your body. Just keep going, and then I'm going to home in on that.
Yeah, so it's just something like it might be something like when I was at school. I walked down. I was in sixth form doing my A levels, and I was supposed to go off to university to do science. And there was just this sign on the notice board with an American flag on it, and it said, "Be an exchange student, go and live in the US for a year before university." And I just saw it, and I just thought, "Oh yeah, that sounds amazing. I'm going to do that." And so I did that. And it wasn't like it wasn't, I hadn't thought about that in advance or planned it, or, it's just, something unexpected happened. And then it's almost just like, yeah. And it was such an incredible experience. I lived in Ohio for a year. And then, because I grew up in Sevenoaks in Kent, which is amazing, but it's a very sort of certain kind of, I'm trying to think of the word, sort of, limited,
let's say conservative.
It can feel like quite a small world. So to go somewhere completely different was a great experience for me. And then again, doing the PhD was a bit of a whim, to be honest. And, it was hard, but I'm really glad now that I did it. And then this sort of science communication thing, I just saw the thing and I was just like, yes, it's just that sort of yes feeling. Or even more recently, starting the podcast. I think if I'd thought about it too much, I would have been too scared. You find all sorts of
it's not an
reasons not to
intellectual
do
process,
something.
right? But it's interesting, though, that you're taking intellectualism, science, and communicating it through intuition. And when you were touching or putting your hands towards your body, you were doing it. And I do exactly the same thing when I talk about intuition. It's here. It's the upper chest, a lower throat and upper chest, where you speak and where you feel, right? Where your heart feels, not so much your gut. That's obviously down here. But I think all of us, when we start to talk about these things, and I have a very similar thing to you, that if I get it's not even an idea, but when a thing comes up in front of me somehow that seems clear that I must follow it, it's like it grabs me here and goes, dunk. I can actually feel it physically somewhere in this sector as like a forward pull. It's like sometimes when I've talked about that, people say, well, how did you end up being able to feel that? I've got my own story with that, I think. But with you, given that, you came out of Tunbridge Wells, Sevenoaks area, which is also, high culture as well. It's conservative, but it's also very educated. It's also a liberal minded. I think for American viewers and listeners, conservative in England doesn't necessarily mean what it means in the USA. You can be conservative and extremely liberal minded.
Well, my parents were very out of step politically anyway with the surroundings in Sevenoaks, so that they were like lifelong Labour supporters. I grew up under Margaret Thatcher, and she was like the most hated person in our house. So yeah. So I guess there's a certain amount of maybe like thinking for yourself that you sort of glean from that kind of thing as well. And I think it's a massive privilege to have a feeling of maybe sort of confidence and safety that you can sort of take a risk. Not
Right.
everybody has that, and I feel hugely lucky that they were able to give that to me. And then I guess, but also I'm just terrible at planning ahead. I'm just not good at seeing the path very far in the future. So I think you kind of have to just be open to what's presenting itself to you at the time. And it's actually, I think having kids, I put that on the back burner slightly. There was this really strange experience when I was pregnant with my daughter. I was in India, and I went out there with a friend, and we just traveled around for a bit while I was pregnant, because it was, you're...
Why not go get immediate
be
dysentery
over
while
soon,
pregnant?
but
That's a fantastic thing to do.
yeah, but life is never going to be the same again. And we were up. It was some temple, but it was high. There were these high rocks, and my friend just casually just sort of jumped from this. There was a big sort of, it wasn't that wide, but it was a very deep sort of chasm, like a drop between these two bits of rock, and she just jumped over, and I went to follow her, and then there was something in me that I couldn't follow her. I couldn't jump. It was, and I think it was I think, and I'd never really experienced that before. And yeah, I think it was, because I do martial arts. I used to teach jiu-jitsu. I have a second dan in jiu-jitsu, and so it's, you're used to just trust your body, taking risks, and suddenly there was something inside me just going, no, you're not. And so I think there's maybe something about pregnancy and parenthood and children, and you have to maybe put that on one side a little bit, and you're thinking about a different center. But now that the kids are getting a bit older, it's definitely, I'm feeling able to be a bit more free again, and just make decisions that just feel right at the time.
Why martial arts? Why jiu-jitsu? Where did that begin?
Well, it started while I was at university. When I started my PhD, actually, I you want to meet people. So it was just a sort of fairly,
You don't necessarily meet people through jiu-jitsu, though. There's other avenues of meeting people. Why that?
Yeah, why did I want to do a martial
Very
art?
specific. Even within
well, I
arts
tried
practice.
different martial arts. I went to karate and kung fu and all these different ones. And a lot of martial arts is...
Had you always been since a kid doing martial arts?
No. I mean, I did some ballet lessons and some music lessons. I think of it, no. I can't.
What made you during your PhD say, I need to pursue the martial arts path? It's interesting.
I mean, it's... What I can say is that it was perhaps connected to this feeling of wanting to understand and see the world differently. Because when I was younger, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are the same, but I was fascinated by ancient Egypt, aliens. I wanted to be an astrobiologist studying like life on other planets. So the more different the kind of worlds and the worldview, the better, I think. And so martial arts isn't just a sport. It's this access to this whole other philosophy and way of seeing the world that I think really appealed to me at the time. If you're just going to go to tennis club or something, I mean, tennis is great, but it didn't have that extra dimension of personal development and, this other sort of philosophy. So it was interesting that while I was doing the genetics PhD, I was also doing the jiu-jitsu. And I tried a few different martial arts, and a lot of them are just rows of blokes just being macho, punching the air.
I've seen quite a lot of jiu-jitsu macho blokes too.
Well,
so
yeah,
why
I think I
jiu-jitsu?
was lucky with the club that I joined, but also it's jiu-jitsu. It's related to Aikido, and so there's a lot of physics in it. You have to really understand the physics of the movement and the way that you're moving and relate. You're mostly training together in partners because there's no attacking in jiu-jitsu. That was another thing I liked about it. It's all defense. So you might have to simulate an attack so that someone can practice their defense, but there's no actual, you do not attack. And it was drilled into us from the beginning that the winning means you didn't have to fight in the first place. There's this whole other part of jiu-jitsu, which is being aware of your situation and your surroundings and how you influence things around you so that you don't have any need to fight. And so that's the ultimate aim, I suppose. And that appealed to me. But yeah, because it's all about, so rather than just say karate to block a punch, you stand there and the person's punching and you're really strong and you do this block and you basically just bash the punch out of the way. And, people are punching blocks of wood and all of this is like strength. Whereas jiu-jitsu is much more about somebody's coming in and you just move your center ever so slightly and you kind of, you come into your opponent to get inside that movement and you're just from the inside, you're just guiding it. You're just changing the direction so that the faster that punch, whatever that attack is coming in, the heavier they are, the faster they are, the better, because gives you more power to basically channel them down into the ground, essentially. But it's really good for women and it's really good for smaller people because it's not about strength against strength. It's about skill and it's about understanding the physics of the movement. And so as soon as I started it, that really appealed to me. So it's that, yeah, it's just, but also there's this whole, just different mindset, different way of looking at things. There's a mindset called Mushin, which is translated as no mind. It's not really no mind, but it's this really focused state that you have to sort of, not that I necessarily have achieved it, but the idea is that you lose it. It should be no self, really. You lose your sense of self. That when the attacks are coming in, you lose all self-consciousness so that you're just purely 100% focused on meeting the challenge. And, so that side of things is also really fascinating to me. And I probably played quite a big role in why, with the science, I've always been questioning that worldview. Haven't just been like, yeah, science, but it's more that I'm interested in that sort of the ideas and the assumptions and how could we look at the world differently. Sorry, that was a really long answer to you.
Well, that's a really good answer because I think that with science, it's generally attack and defense, right? People take a position. If it's academic, their funding, their job, the grants that they have to go get, the publishing that they have to do is all dependent on them being able to defend a position in a way that other people perceive them as right with a capital R. And then we know that always science will change. So there'll always be challenges. And because people's livelihoods and mortgages and families depend upon being right, then they literally will have to die on those hills. It's only if they are independently wealthy or something like that that they can say, well, you know what, actually, yeah, I'm going to switch my position now because I'm convinced of this. And I'm economically somehow removed from, I can be sort of play it like a gentleman's game. But that's actually not how it plays out for most people in academia or in research, right? Because they're coming out of backgrounds where they need a job and the job is predicated on being right. So it becomes attack, block, defense, exactly that process that you were talking about with karate. It's interesting to me that you take this, well, what's the way through thing? And you yourself, although you're a scientist, you didn't decide to go and be an academic. So you don't have to defend a particular geneticist's position at some university and worry that you can't pay the mortgage for your kids because you might end up being wrong. You can afford to be wrong because you can investigate in the book and you can say, well, I started sort of with this premise, but actually I ended up with that premise. And of course, in the writing of a book, that's much more interesting. That's what we want. That's a story arc, right? We're much more interested in Joe Marchant coming in and saying, well, I thought it was here, but actually I realized it was over here. If you came in and said, well, I thought it was here and I still think it's over here, you're like, well, that's great, but not as interesting as if you hadn't. So
yeah, I think that's absolutely, I mean, you've kind of put your finger on what I think it takes to be a good journalist, which is that you always have to be open. You're always the one asking the questions, and you're just trying to soak up everything from everybody that you talk to. There is absolutely no point in being a journalist or a writer if you already know all the answers before you start.
No, you can be honest and say, I've got a bent this way. Like, for example, if I'm writing about my experiences in the Kalahari, I can be upfront and say, do I believe I'm on team shamanism because I've experienced so much of it? But I would like to know more about how it works. And maybe I thought it worked this way, but actually I realized it works that way. So I think it's all right to say, I have some sort of a position, as long as you're sort of upfront about it.
If I thought I knew all the answers, I would have no reason to write a book in the first place, because for me, a book's not about, oh, well, I know all this stuff, let me tell you everything that I know. And I'm sure there are some great people who write books in that way, but that's just, for me, writing a book is, I'm really doing it because I want to go somewhere, I want to travel somewhere, I want to discover something. And so the book is just my vehicle for my self-centered excuse for doing that, I suppose.
Is the secret then to a sort of self-actualized life? Because I think you're living one. I think without a doubt, one could say you're living one in all sorts of spheres. Does it really just come down to intense curiosity? Is that the basic ingredient that's necessary?
I love the word curiosity. Yeah, I think curiosity is so important that in everything in life. I think if you're not curious, you're basically shrinking and dying. So,
Yeah.
like, I don't think there is any stasis in life. I've kind of come to realize, like, that you're either growing and exploring and changing, or you're kind of shrinking and falling back. Like, especially as you get older as well, you kind of think about these things more. And I think you have to just keep almost like reinventing yourself and look, like, yeah, being curious about the people around you, the places around you, how does the world work, and sort of being open and to all of those interactions. And I think maybe it's tempting as you get older to want to kind of settle and almost cling on to those things that seem solid, that you've worked out. But I think that's a bit of an illusion, really. It's just, so for me, what keeps me interested and what makes life worth living, I suppose, is that you're always moving forward and finding out new things. And I suppose through that, it changes you as well. And I think that's where good writing comes from, because you're going on that journey and taking people with you. And I think those are the kinds of books I like reading as well. I think they're just so much more engaging than, let me tell you all about the science of X. That just feels quite static and boring to me. That's just, yeah.
All right, so you've looked at the sky. So at The Cure, you've looked at the sky. So what are you looking at now? What's next?
Well, so the book that is coming out next is coming out in February, March in the US, and it's called In Search of Now, The Science of the Present Moment. And I think as I've been writing the books, Cure and the Human Cosmos as well, got me really interested in, like, what is reality? Basically, everything I write, you look deeper and deeper, and you come down to this sort of fundamental, like, what is our relationship with the universe that we're living in? Like, who are we? What is so? It's and I suppose the sort of I don't know what the word is, like the sort of apex of that for me is now, because we take it so for granted, but there's so many tensions inside now. You've got the whole mindfulness movement, and we experience the present moment and be open to the present moment, and everything you live and you experience is now. That's all we have. So there's and when you're meditating, you're trying to sort of be aware of what's happening in the present. And yet from I still see myself as sort of coming from as a scientist in some way, and from an objective point of view, what the physicists would most of the physicists would say is there is no such thing as now. That there is no objective present moment. There is no moment of happening out there in the world. whether you're looking at that from the point of view of Einstein's relativity or cosmology or quantum, whatever it is, that there is no moment of happening that applies. So now is a personal perspective, basically. I mean, Einstein showed that the same event can be past, present, or future depending on your perspective. So there's no special like time at which that thing happens. So you've got now is everything on the one hand from our perspective, a human sort of subjective perspective, and then now doesn't even exist from the point of view of objective science. So it's like, what? Like, so the book is, how do we make sense of this? How do we bring those two things together? Like, what actually what is
So
it present moment?
how
How
do
does that
we
get created?
how do we make sense of it and bring them together?
Well, yeah, well, so from a personal perspective, I look at, the present moment is not just a moment in time, I think is what I, concluded. You can't sort of, it's not like you've got a timeline and then you can chop it up into little tiny instants, and the one that's happening now is now. Every moment, every now moment that you experience is a sort of integrated product of, a very sort of short timescale things happening, and like little millisecond sort of changes in, light and sound and whatever. And then, slightly longer packets of meaning in terms of, you're putting together my words into sentences, and sort of longer, we're doing this interview, we've got a sense of, across an hour or two, like this is the bubble that we're in. You've got these much longer sort of strands and threads of like who you are in your life, like where you're going. We've each got a sense of ourselves, as humans at this moment in the world, and this long evolutionary history that's behind us. We feel that we're living in a universe that's, 14 billion years old. So every moment is not just one time. If it was just one instant isolated, there would be no meaning in the world. There'd be no memories, there'd be no dreams for the future, there'd be no musical phrases or songs, there'd be no story. So every moment that you experience is weaving together all of these different timescales. And there's some really interesting neuroscience about how that happens in the brain, because you can see those sort of hierarchical temporal structures in brain activity. So the sort of, what I'm saying there is that a moment is absolutely not something you're going to find out in the physical universe, in the world somewhere. It's in you. So now is a personal perspective. But then the thing that I think is really fascinating is there's quite a lot of, there are some scientists, both from the sort of cognitive science perspective and also from physics, actually saying that doesn't mean that the moment isn't real, that personal perspective kind of is reality, that it's those perspectives interacting that are what make up the universe, that are what make up the world. So that the universe isn't just a collection of atoms that we're just somehow observing. It's like a patchwork of all of the different perspectives and experienced worlds interacting together. And we can communicate and agree on patterns and maybe, infer the existence of atoms or infer the existence of the Big Bang however long ago. But they're just shared inferences, that what's real is the interacting perspectives. I have no idea if any of that made sense to you.
No, it does. Well, I think what you put your finger on is ambiguity. So, everything is always the opposite of itself. Everything is always the antithesis of itself. Any idea that I have is both right and wrong. Any moment that I experience is both has existed in the future, I'm having it now, and then it's gone and it's in the past. With the son, Bushman, who I spent so much time with, would talk about time in a vertical sense. They'd say it's all existing at the same time. But yes, you can, to some degree, choose, particularly as you begin to explore altered states of consciousness, you can to some degree choose how you experience that vertical time. And you can, to some degree, shift in and out of different elevator floors of it, including in everyday life. Like, for example, when they hunt, the ability to go inside the mind of the animal that you hunt, because it's stronger, faster, can run all day. There's no way you can actually get close to it unless you go into some kind of other process. Or a plant, you have to have some sort of way of talking to the plant. And people say, oh, for that, maybe you take a mushroom or something. But there's nothing like that growing there. So they have to find ways to, just for pure survival, so it's both esoteric and 100% practical. Like back to what we were talking about with Cure, bedside manner and placebo effect alongside pharmaceuticals or what you were talking about with intuition and martial arts. And, I think what you described as I was listening to you talk about jujitsu, you described a flow state, basically, right? And what is a flow state but an absolute being in the present moment? I have it when I'm with horses a lot, so if I'm heading in at a fence to jump a fence, for example, at the moment of commitment, I'm unaware of time. I am aware of danger. And there's that slightly fucking shit feeling, if I don't make it, because I know what can happen. And at the same time, I'm completely now with the motion and the emotion of my horse. We are a unit at that point. And then if we're separate, it will go very wrong. But I can't try to be at one with him. I can only, through repetition of this thing, familiarize myself to the point that I'm no longer aware of it as some separate state, like Rupert is on a horse jumping a fence. It's just this thing that happens, and this comes over time. So when you're exploring now, the word that came up as you were talking was ambiguity. This idea that you can hold a seemingly separate or seemingly opposite or paradoxical concepts together in the same, I guess, moment. No pun intended.
Yeah, that's so interesting. There's so many things that I could pick up on there. I think one of the things I found really interesting was the idea of thinking about experience and reality in terms of complex systems. So, like a wave or a hurricane or a Starling murmuration, where something becomes more
Starling murmuration, that's a really good example. Yes.
Yeah, because the sort of conventional reductionist view would be, well, there's just all these particles, and then they're bouncing around according to, laws of motion.
Or there's one lead Starling who says, now turn left.
Yeah, or that you can somehow predict everything that's going to happen from the bottom up, just from just basically particles bouncing. But the problem is, and this is why you have all of these scientists concluding things like we don't have free will, is because if you have that system, all you've got is particles bouncing around. Nothing can ever be more than the sum of its parts. We are ultimately made of these atoms, and so whatever those atoms do bouncing around, that's what we do. And we have our consciousness, there's nothing you can do about it. And logically, you cannot fault that. But I think where they've gone wrong is that that's not actually how reality works. And a lot of scientists are coming more to this idea of a complex system where you have the parts and the whole interacting together with sort of lines of causation going up and down. So you can look at reality in terms of atoms, but you can also look at it in terms of cells or of organisms or of a Starling murmuration or life, or so if you think about the way I would see it is that our minds is made of exactly the same stuff. It's all just patterns of experiences, but it's just a more integrated sort of holistic, sort of a more integrated sort of complex state in a way that can then start to have an effect on what's happening. And the same with you talk about with your riding your horse, that system is a bit like a Starling murmuration, but for the term, you become one system, and that system can act in ways and affect the world in ways that you couldn't each have done on your own. You become something greater than the sum of the parts. And so it's thinking about that as that's a real thing in the world. I mean, one definition of what it means to exist is to be able to cause things to happen, to have an effect on the world. So I think it's super interesting.
Are you aware, I was just looking this up while you were talking, so it made me think, as you were talking, maybe my mind went to simulation theory. Are you exploring that in your next book at all, or is that on your list?
No, it's not on my list. Tell me about simulation theory.
Well, it's, like you, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and interestingly, more and more physicists and computer scientists and other types of scientists are coming to a sort of similar conclusion around God, around fields of consciousness, around what is in fact the collective consciousness. And there's a particular guy, I'm reading his name here, Roman Yampolsky. God, that is complex. Yamp, like that's the easy bit, YAMP, and then it's Polsky with an I before the Y. Yampolsky. Okay, he's one of several. Brian Keating, Donald Hoffman is another one, where increasingly there's a sense that we could be living in some sort of a simulation that is going through, like when we create computer models of something, we will now run like a billion simulations to see what the potential probable outcome might be, blah, 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 blah. And whether that's in gaming or whether that's in, I'm trying to understand weather systems or the world or AI. And these ideas, it was like, who is God? What creates our sense of self, time, and space consciousness, where we began? You might be familiar with, the early Christian Gnostic tradition, although you're not supposed to pronounce the G, the Gnostic tradition, which all got, booted out with Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity. But for the first few hundred years of Christianity, it was as strong a strand within Christianity, the Christianities, as what we consider it to be now. And it posits that, and this is a download anyway from Greek and Egyptian and from Babylonian and etc. as well, back to where we began. But these beliefs posit, because they're pre-Christian too, that there's something called a demiurge, and that God as we know it, the creator as we know it, is actually a faulty being who is somehow bigger than us, but below actual God, who came up with an idea to kind of create a bit of an experimental playing field. And we are, to some degree, pawns in that game. And that's why we get knocked around. And that's why things are really imperfect. And that's why they're suffering, effectively. But we can rise above that and sort of make contact with the greater divine that even the demiurge is only a part of, etc. And then that all gets kicked out. And then they only find it again with the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1946 or whenever they found it. And now they realize that actually this branch of Christianity was as big as what we consider now. They just did a very good job of suppressing it for a couple of thousand years or whatever. Simulation theory seems to come down to something not dissimilar from that, almost like a more modern way of understanding something like that. And it seems that one of the things you're touching on there with your idea about the present moment and what is the present moment opens up that Pandora's box to some degree once again of saying, well, yes, are we in fact figments of something else's imagination? Because it's a little bit too weird otherwise in some strange way. And is it worth just perhaps considering that? And when I've been listening to scientists talk about simulation, I was like, I don't know. Yeah. But this bloke, Roman Yampolsky, gave me pause for thought. And I don't think it necessarily matters whether we are or whether we aren't. I think it's interesting to consider, and it might, if it did turn out to be true, we might not know until after we die. We might never know. It might help to make some things clear, but it's a spiritual scientific perspective. It's, again, an ambiguous perspective. I just wondered what your thoughts around something like that are.
Yeah, I've heard of this idea of, are we all, simulations, sort of just, trapped in some simulation of aliens or higher beings or whatever it is. And there's that whole statistical argument of that's much more likely, because if they did make a simulation, you could have loads of copies of that, so it's more likely we'd be in one of those than in reality. And
that's the sort of parallel worlds and other worlds theory, and in a nutshell, in a weird way.
It doesn't really appeal to me, because I think for me, I don't even know what that would mean to be a simulation. Like for me, interaction and experience, the interactions that we're having with the world that we're experiencing are real. That, for me, that's what reality
is.
But
they would posit that if you were a character in a computer game that had been, in a very sophisticated one that had been programmed, then your experience would still be completely real.
Yeah, I actually quote from the movie Free Guy in the book. I don't know if you know Free Guy.
No, I don't. Tell me about that.
It's got Ryan Reynolds in it. It's a, it's just a sort of light movie, but it's actually really clever, because Guy is a character he doesn't know it, but he's a character in a video game. He's actually an NPC, like a non-player character in this video game. And so he's living his life with this city and in the city and working in a bank. And there's all these people who come around like shooting and, all this crime going on.
Pain in the arse people. Right.
But he comes to realize that he's actually not a real person. He's just this NPC. Turns out the people who sort of wrote the game in the first place and put a kind of AI into the characters. So this sort of AI is and when he realizes, he goes around kicking things and shouting, and he's just going, none of it matters, we're not real, none of it matters. And he goes to see his best friend, and the friend is like, what do you mean? Like, you're here, I'm here, I'm just trying to help my friend when he's feeling bad, so this moment here, this moment is
Doesn't mean we're
real.
not, well, and it's, yes, if everything comes down to love, if all matter is love and God is love and love is God, then even if you were a character in a simulation, you would
But I
still be
don't even know
experiencing
what
love,
that
wouldn't
means.
you?
For me, experience can't be simulated. It's real in its own right. And I think that's what this character was trying to say.
Indeed.
Was, I am here with you. We are here together.
No, I agree with you 100%.
So that's not a simulation. Whether there are sort of other forces out there controlling things that you can't control, maybe, I don't know. But for me, it's not. Existence is not a simulation, because it's the one, it's because it's 100%. You experience something, you experience it. It's,
But just because we experience it, does that, and what are we experiencing? So, for example, if my dog experiences me in certain ways, he only has a certain grasp on the full reality of what's going on. He can make some pretty astute guesses, but ultimately, he is to some degree a character in my simulation of my life with a dog. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have his own entire universe that's completely independent of me, that I will never know because I'm not a dog. And he has interactions with others.
Exactly. So he's the same as you. We're all in our limited perspective. Like, none of us is omniscient. And what I think is a really interesting perspective that's arising in science, because science is based on this, God's eye view, if we could look at the universe from outside. And now there are scientists. There's a guy called Chris Fuchs, Fuchs, quantum physicist, who's pioneered this new interpretation of quantum physics. I've just interviewed him on my podcast.
Chris,
as well.
where's he based out of?
He's at University of Boston, Massachusetts.
All right. Tell us about it.
And it's called cubism, QBism, his sort of style of quantum physics. And he is saying that the universe is essentially, it's just made up of a whole load of insides. There's your dog's world and your world and my world. We've all got our own world and our own universe. And the sort of conventional view would be that those are all limited views of something bigger, that there's a sort of landscape out there, and we've each got our perspective on it, which is flawed and fallible and limited, and there's the real thing that's out there somewhere. And he's saying, no, there's no real thing that's out there. There's just your dog's world and your world and my world, and we're all constrained by each other. We're all bouncing off each other and interacting off each other, and sort of affecting the possibilities of each other. So we're all in a world that we're interacting with, that's constraining us and that we can push back against and that can surprise us. But that world is made up of all the other inner worlds. So it's a reality made of perspective, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
and it doesn't mean that everything's in your head
really.
and you can do whatever you want and you're making it up, because everyone else is out there as well. But there's no other kind of real world that we're all experiencing copies of. What you experience is part of the universe. And I love that view.
Where does free will come into that?
Free will comes into that because if there's a real world out there separate from us, that's made of atoms that are just bouncing around and doing what the laws of physics tell them to do, there is no room for us to make any choices or affect anything, because the laws, the atoms or particles or microparticles, whatever, they're going to do what the laws of physics say. There's no extra way that your mind, your choice of what kind of coffee to have, can affect what those atoms are doing. There's just, because they're already completely determined.
That's assuming that we understand the laws of physics, right? I mean, we might understand a bit of it, but not the whole, right?
Yeah. But then the argument goes, well, even if there's chance in the universe, so the laws of physics aren't determining everything, but there's a bit of chance in there as well. They would say, so somebody like Carlo Rovelli, for example, or Sean Carroll or Brian Greene, these are all physicists who've written about determinism and causation and free will. They would all say there's whether there's chance involved or not, maybe we can't predict everything, but there's still no extra way that your mind can somehow reach down and affect what those atoms are doing. That's just not in physics. They're just doing, what they do. Because we're made of those atoms, everything we do, everything our brains do, it is just an effect of that. And you might have this illusion that you've made a decision about something, that we decided to have this conversation today, but that was just the atoms. They're always going to do that, where we just feel as if we made a choice about something. And for me, that's it's just so idiotic. I just think this is people who've spent too much time working with mathematical equations and thinking that they're therefore maths explains everything.
Well, that also sounds a lot like trying to be right to me. Yeah.
And I think
would
the
it
problem is
matter,
this.
even if that was the case, like even if you and I were having this conversation just because of atoms colliding, and we felt that we'd had this, then the feeling is enough, isn't it? I mean,
and I suppose they would say that. So we have the feeling, and even though it doesn't mean anything and it doesn't really affect anything, we can enjoy the feeling. Fine, but I think that there's enough people out there in cognitive science and in physics and in philosophy saying, actually, there's not, we have no evidence whatsoever that the world is made of particles. And in fact, if you do quantum physics and you drill down to that individual particle level, you do not find anything. There is nothing there. And so the idea is that actually, what if reality is made up of patterns of probabilities, that causation isn't just one particle hitting another, but there's just probabilistic constraints, if you like. There's just patterns of probability. So I'm not explaining this very well, but essentially, if your experience, your sort of integrated experience exists in its own right, and we can basically, all you can do in the universe is you can take an action and you can experience a response. That's what we're doing. That's what you're doing when you perceive. You're acting on the world and you're experiencing what comes back. That's what physicists are doing. They're doing an experiment, they're making a measurement, and they're getting a response. What lies behind that, we don't really know. We can build up these theories that help us to predict really, really accurately what we're going to experience next. But the sort of the idea that I'm really fascinated by and trying to sort of explain in the book is that what if that pattern of experience and response is reality? So all of the scientific theories are really important and useful and valid, and we can use them to sort of make incredible predictions about what's going to happen, but they aren't real in themselves. An atom, that model could change. Scientists could change their mind and come up with a whole new theory, or the Big Bang, maybe we'll come up with a whole new theory for that. It's just a really powerful model.
Idea.
Yeah,
it's an idea.
What's real is the actions you're taking on the world and the results that you're getting back, and that is non-negotiable. If you experience something, that is it. That's reality. No, that's, nobody can tell you that that's not real. And so the idea would be of reality as being all of those worlds interacting with each other, and there is no God's eye omniscient perspective. There's no extra reality out there. It's just all of us.
If you made it this far into the podcast, then I'm guessing you're somebody that, like me, loves to read books about not just how people have achieved self-actualization, but particularly about the relationship with nature, spirituality, life, the universe, and everything. And I'd like to draw your attention to my books. If you would like to read the story of how we even arrived here, perhaps you'd like to check out the 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Horseboy and The Long Ride Home, and come on an adventure with us and see what engendered, what started Live Free, Ride Free. And before we go back to the podcast, also check out The Healing Land, which tells the story of my years spent in the Kalahari with the Sun, Bushmen, hunter-gatherer people there, and all that they taught me and mentored me in, and all that I learned. Come on that adventure with me.
Is all of us that omniscient I? Is God? Is the divine that?
Well, it's a really interesting question. The way I would see it is that we've become really good at making predictions. Our brains are essentially really sophisticated prediction machines, and we've kind of built up these sort of integrated hierarchical sort of ways of making predictions, and And that, in a sense, is your perspective that you've built. That is yourself. That is your way of seeing the world. And we know from cognitive science that that sense of self, it's not real. It's just a really complex inference. It's just sort of the predictions that your brain is making in order to make, it's based on all of your experience and your sort of path through the world. You kind of build up these theories and probabilities and inferences about what the world is and how it works. And everything you see, your brain is basically pushing down some things and pushing up other things and trying to make sense of what it's seeing, trying to predict what's coming next. And what you see is essentially that prediction. And so that is your kind of sense of self. And I think for me, what happens, when they've done studies with psychedelics as well, to sort of, when people have these ecstatic experiences, I think if we can stop that process, if that breaks down and then this self kind of dissipates, and so all of those sort of prediction processes stop, that sort of basic canvas that's lying underneath, that seems to be what people experience as love. That is just that 100% connection of everything. Does that make sense?
Absolutely it does. I had an experience where I died. I took a very bad fall from a horse. I ended up underneath the horse and it rolled on me. And it wasn't the fall that killed me. It was that I went into, when they rebuilt my leg, the morphine machine in the hospital malfunctioned and I overdosed. And I can thoroughly recommend it, actually. It's a very nice way to go out. I can't imagine if anyone wants to take the exit route while they do anything else. But suddenly I was down the tunnel talking to God. And so I had that experience that everyone describes who's had these types of experiences. There's a tunnel, there's a light at the end. And what was interesting was that in that tunnel there were beings, big sort of light beings that felt sort of benevolent, coming past, shum, shum, as if like off on business somewhere. Let's call them angels. And at the end of the tunnel, there's the light. And the first thing was this profound and utter sense of relief. This kind of, oh man, yeah, home. Yes, going home. Oh yeah. It was like, that's like, yes. Like feel all the weight just like, oh no, income tax, like, oh, brilliant, amazing. And then the light said, in the Douglas Adams way of expressing it, life, the universe, and everything, existence as you know it, is just an experiment in love. And think of the universe like a termite mound or a beehive. And the idea is just to make it and it's composed of love. And the idea is to make it get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And the way you do that, because you guys are just worker drones, termites, is to love actively. And if you love actively, you are doing my work. And if you don't love actively, then you won't be punished for it. There's no hell, there's nothing like that. It's just you won't be as happy as if you do, because you're sort of going against the grain rather than through the grain. And anyway, love's nice. And anything else that you choose to do in your life is up to you. That's fine. This is your choice. And I remember thinking, oh yeah, of course. Yeah, that sort of makes perfect sense. Yeah, of course. Yeah. And then I thought, oh shit, my son. And my autistic son, and thinking, no. And I didn't have this sense of, I must go back. I had this sense of, okay, you're going back. And the going back was not terribly easy. It felt like, if you've ever walked through wheat, and imagine the wheat was made of plasma, like slightly sticky, gooey plasma. It felt really physical like that. And then I could see my body sitting on the gurney, and boom, I'm suddenly back in there. And my wife, who's German, is standing next to me with this expression. And I try to speak to say, and it comes out as, I'm like, oh shit, am I brain damaged? So I sort of managed to marshal my senses and said, am I okay? And she goes, I'm like, fuck yeah, couldn't you just lie once? Just like, she can't lie. And luckily sense of humor returned and so forth. And later, because the hospital had actually, been at fault, people said, this is in America, in Texas, aren't you going to sue? Like, you can make millions. I'm like, no way am I going to sue. Because I just had the most profoundly incredible experience of my life, the most beautiful experience. No way am I going to sully it with that. I will have a little chat with the hospital and suggest that they maybe up their game a little bit, because the next person they do that to might not be quite as forgiving as me. But blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the bottom line, though, was, in my experience, that touching with the divine, similar to the experience I talked about on the mountain in Cape Town a couple of decades before that, was utterly, utterly real. And, people might say, well, Rupert, that's a product of your imagination, or you somehow expected to see that, or your subconscious projected that, or you maybe read something like that. And so, or it was some sort of hallucination. And then we talked about gut feelings and intuitions, like, no, sorry, it was real. And one could argue it out, but it was real. What's your feeling about the divine then? If we come down to, as you said, you get beyond particles, you find that there's nothing there, but perhaps there's this blank canvas, you said, of something that might be love. And then I said, is that what God is? Is that what it all is, actually? How does life go from that to particles and matter and so forth? You're a geneticist, you're a scientist. I'm with you. I do feel that there is that blank canvas of love. And I'd say that my experiences confirm that from my subjective. So how do we then, how does it happen then? Is it vibrations? Is it frequencies? Is it light? Is it love? If it goes through certain frequencies, just sort of coalesces into matter? And what's going on? Why do we experience life as material?
Okay. I mean, so all I can tell you is what makes sense to me based on, the different science that I've looked at. So I'm not, professing to have any special insight into the nature of reality, but just in terms of being interested in trying to work out what makes sense to me, I think that I mentioned the metaphor earlier of an ocean. And so within that ocean, you have, the atoms and the molecules of water and the water droplets and little eddies and little whirlpools, and then the bigger kind of waves and currents and seas and building up to the entire ocean. And, yes, the particles are real. And so is the whole ocean. And it's all one thing. And so there's different levels of organization that you can look at, and different structures that can, appear and dissipate within that overall structure. But it's all ultimately one thing. And I think that's how I see reality. And that and that it's all made of perception, I think, essentially, for me, like, you're having interactions and you're sort of perceiving and you're experiencing. And if you try and drill down to a sort of the lowest level of things, that we can sort of have this sort of shared pattern of experiences that we can agree on, we can explain that in terms of atoms or molecules. And then maybe you would see us as a sort of higher level of organization. Maybe we're the sort of the eddies or the whirlpools within the ocean, and we're sort of, you can have your own, it has its own, might have its own identity, but it's still completely made of and connected to everything else that exists. And you could have two eddies, like you and your horse could come together and form a bigger whirlpool, and then perhaps separate again.
Yeah, sort of vortices of
like vortices. Yeah. And then then at higher levels of organization, a society can come together, or beliefs can, so I would see a sort of a belief in money, or a god,
or a sperm and an egg.
Yeah. And so even beliefs can be structures, whirlpools or tides that can have impacts. Like money isn't real, but the way that it impacts our behavior, it has very, very real effects on the world. Yeah. So I think I would just see it as a hierarchy, a bit like that. There's all these structures can arise and dissipate and interact with each other, but that the whole ocean, the whole thing, then if you wanted to use the word God for that, then I can, then that seems to be like an appropriate word. So it's more just a name for this kind of miracle of continued existence, I suppose, that you could say, that's just pushing forwards. And there's this idea in Eastern philosophy about being time, and this idea that time isn't the sort of time of the clock, but time is just the experienced universe, like bursting into existence, all of it, all of those experienced worlds, everything, all bursting into existence every moment. and it never stops, and it's bursting and it's bursting and it's bursting and it's bursting, and this sort of that incredible creation that's unstoppable.
Cosmic dance.
Yeah, then I guess maybe if you were religious, you would, you could call that God. There's this paper by a philosopher that I read, and he was saying, that a lot of thinkers would see that as God, and another word that you could use for that actually is now. It's this miraculous ongoing creation of now that isn't just one universe, it's all of those experience universes, all because we're all completely tied to each other. Everything you experience is dependent on everything that's gone before and everything that everyone else is experiencing, and it all kind of bursts into existence at once. And for me, that's incredible and miraculous. And I would be happy to call that God, I think.
Fantastic. You answered the question, Joe.
I tried. I mean, that's the way I it makes sense to me where I am right now. And I think all any of us can do is find answers to these questions that make sense for us where we are at that moment in time. And it's felt really freeing for me to see reality not as concrete things, but to see reality as interactions and connections and perception, and what I'm experiencing, what everyone else is experiencing, and to see that as real. And I think it's just so much more, it feels so much more sort of vivid and immersive than this idea that there's lots of stuff out there that we're somehow watching through our eyes like little movie cameras. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because that couldn't ever be enough. And it can explain a few things, but not enough things. And it always leaves one going, yeah, but hold on. I think you might have just actually answered the nature of existence. So I think
You'll have to read the book when it comes out and tell me if you're convinced. But what I love is that science, even though a lot of science is based on these sort of materialist, reductionist assumptions that I don't feel really address the nature of existence, there are a lot of scientists now who are rejecting that and saying, no, we need to think completely differently about what reality and existence are made of. And all the stuff that I've been talking to you about is based on that kind of science. So it's still evidence-based. It's still looking at, well, how does the brain actually work? How does perception work? How does
still inquiry. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in the past, I wouldn't have felt comfortable saying a lot of things to you that I have just said, because it would have felt like that's not scientific, or that's, fringe, or that's pseudoscience. But actually, I think for me, it's the most evidence-based way of looking at reality that we have. And that this idea of reality is just made of these atoms out there bouncing around, sort of somehow separate from us. That's not evidence-based.
No, that's just a philosophy, honestly, at the end of the day. It's an idea like any
it's
other.
A faith. Yeah. It's a worldview,
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
No, and it's interesting listening to you speak. I was thinking back to, again, hunter-gatherer people that I've spent a lot of time with. So I spent a lot of where life is all about tracking, and you're tracking. You have a when you live like that, you have an intimate relationship with about 300 different species constantly, minimum.
Wow. That's
not the case in our modern world. Even me, I'm surrounded by animals. I work with animals. I work with all different kinds of animals. I'm in nature all the time. It's still not like that. But when you're with these people, everything from certain types of insect to, slugs, and how their trails interact and what they tell you about the passage of birds and how that tells you about something. It's all happening all the time. And they say when you're tracking, you're dancing with God, and that it's a flow state. It's pure happiness. It's the present moment. It's also survival. You've got to know how to do it. But it's, of course, goes beyond tracking the thing. So you can track the kudu, you can track the rabbit, but in order to track the rabbit, you have to track the grasses, you have to track the grasshoppers, you have to track the wind, you have to track the idea of what is rabbit, you have to track the idea of who is rabbit, and is there some field in which a rabbit and I can meet on a non-material level so that I can actually materially get the rabbit. And all of this seems to be absolutely bound up with the authentic human experience. So these are the oldest cultures on the planet. They're the ones watching the sky originally. They're the ones asking these questions for the first, and to some degree answering these questions, because they get sick and get better through these non-rational, rational means. They were around before our rationalist philosophy, reductionist philosophy. They're still here. We often talk about, our hunter and gatherer ancestors, as if they disappeared from the planet. They're still here, just not in Southwest 2, but they are here, and they will be around after things collapse because they stand the test of time. They're not dependent upon all the structures that we're dependent upon. Okay, fine. So it seems that these questions and the practices of dancing through these questions is as old as humanity and has had to be. That makes sense. But I think what's really interesting about your work is that you're saying, yes, that's true, Ru, but we're living in Southeast London right now. This is the reality we're at. So we need to come out with a way of doing that same process. With each generation has to rethink it. And so the reductionist way of science, you could say that emulates tracking. Like, I must find the spoor of that antelope and know that it's different from that antelope, and know that the time of day, there's certain things that tell me that that antelope will be available and that antelope will not be available, and so on and so on. You could say, well, that's just a purely scientific reductionist process. And then you say, yeah, but then they have to become kudu in order to actually run the thing down, because otherwise there's no way they're going to get close to it, because it runs the speed of a horse but can run all day. Oh, well, then we need this non-rational means of making that be successful.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely. I think we need those two things. And I think the reductionist approach is, well, we're going to sort of split everything up into its little pieces and build it up from sort of first principles. But what the hunters are doing, you use the word non-materialist, but I think it's more about integration. It's what people are incredible at doing is sort of integrating all of these different influences. Every experience we've had through our lives, every connection that we've ever had is sort of feeding into your intuition and your perception, and we can. So we're just, whereas science is incredibly powerful in its own way, human experience is just able to integrate a much more sort of complex, subtle set of inputs. And so you can come up with something that you might say it's non-rational, because we don't know exactly how it was arrived at. But I think it's just a more sophisticated, integrated sort of conclusion, if you like. And I think this is why AI is now taking off, because
that was obviously going to be my next question, right?
Yeah, they've stopped trying to program it from first principles, and this means this means this. They've got it to work more like a human brain, where you have all of these different levels of organization that are feeding up and down to each other, and you come out with an output, and it's like we can't specify. We don't know exactly how they reached that, but everything they've learned, all the patterns of probability of all the training materials, all kind of fed into this output, and they're still not doing it, I don't think, anywhere near as sophisticated sort of level of organization as a human can do it. They've got more training material, so they're sort of more powerful in that way. But that's where this sort of leap in their abilities has come from. And I think that's the power of human experience in the human brain, is our ability to integrate all of this stuff in a way that, we say non-rational sometimes in a disparaging way, but I think
like placebo is a bad word.
Yeah, but it's well, with placebo, it's the patient is integrating everything that they've ever experienced through their lives about the inputs and experiences that are likely to lead to improved health, if that makes sense. Every time you've seen a doctor in a white coat and then you felt better afterwards, every time you've ever taken a paracetamol pill and your headache's gone away, or it's going to be different depending on culture, but your brain is just taking in every possible cue and then using every experience you've ever had to kind of predict what that's all likely to link to, what's coming next. And it's incredibly sophisticated, and it makes absolutely perfect sense. But it's just not rational in the way that you couldn't write out every step. And I think that's what we've kind of forgotten how important that is. Yes, we need the sort of rational reductionist approach, but that that ability to integrate all of those different inputs is our sort of human superpower, and it's really important. And the ability to feel part of bigger systems as well. And another thing that I've written about, and I did a radio show about it last year actually, is the emotion of awe. When we're
AWE or
AWE, yes, not ORE. You know, when you're confronted by something that's so vast, it dwarfs you, and you just can't compute, you can't understand it. And what it seems to do is it forces people into a different perspective, that they're no longer seeing themselves as a kind of individual self, but they're seeing themselves as part of something so much bigger. So at the same time, people feel smaller, they draw themselves smaller, they sign their names smaller.
the sense of self goes away to the side.
Yeah, but they feel elevated at the same time. You know, you get this sort of
They
ecstatic.
feel integrated. There's your word. They feel integrated.
Yeah, and so that it's incredible. People feel ecstatic, connected, integrated, but it changes their perspective on life as well. They make more ethical decisions. They feel sort of more connected. They care less about money, more about the planet. People feel as if they have more time. You know, or has this ability to kind of shift people's perspective and sort of shift us from sort of looking down or separating ourselves from everything that's around us, to sort of looking up and seeing ourselves as part of something bigger. And it's slightly different to what we were talking about, but I think the emotion of awe is so important. That, again, this is something that people might have had, you know, people living more traditional lifestyles or people in the past might have had, because you're always being confronted with things that are bigger than you.
Well, I think that's it. I think if you live in nature, you are always in awe.
Yeah.
You cannot not be in a state of awe. And the awe could come from a towering mountain or the night sky, but it could all equally come from the interaction of one small species with another small species that unfolds in front of you in a way that you've never seen before. Or it could be a healing that happens at the fireside, or it could be an expression of art or song, or, you know, it could be any of these things, right?
Absolutely.
And, you know, we talk about awe as if it was something rare, but it's actually, I think, supposed to be just built into the human existence on a daily basis. And if we don't have it, I think we get unhappy and we get depressed and twitchy, but we don't know why, because we might have come from, you know, 10, 12, 20 generations removed from awe, so that when we do see the ocean or something like that, we're overwhelmed and we're reminded. But we're just not seeing it all the time. We're mostly seeing the inside of office buildings and cars and linoleum floors and fluorescent strip lights, and, you know.
Yeah, totally. Our world's become smaller. We're all staring at phone screens, but also safer as well. So you're never at risk.
Ah, yes, you're right, because you need that element of danger.
There has to be an element of losing yourself somehow.
But what's so illusory about that is, of course, in the hunting and gathering reality, it's entirely a culture of problem solving. You don't get together for organized conflict against that group over there, for example. If it's not raining, you don't go and nick all their food because they're not building up food surpluses. And you don't go and hunt all their game out because no one is overpopulating, because when you hunt, you don't overpopulate. So you can then go and negotiate, and it's a tense situation. And the two shamans will come together and people will talk about it. And but that basic case, well, next year it could be you. So, okay, fine, let's broker a deal. Doesn't mean people don't come to blows. Doesn't mean that people don't have jealousies and silly things, but it doesn't escalate, because everybody knows that if the community fragments, every single person will get eaten by a hyena, because you're living in the middle of the food chain, not at the top of the food chain. Now we've reversed that. And now so in that, if you like, original human scenario, the predator is never your fellow human. Not the one who's going to kill you and eat you. No. In our culture, despite the fact that we feel safer, the predator is only and always your fellow human, because we've eradicated. There are no lions in central London. You might get hit by a bus, but if you're going to get taken down, it's probably by another human. And I think this sends us nuts, because somewhere in our consciousness, we know that that's entirely wrong for our species, and that we've created a reality that is a simulation, or whatever we want to call it, that is completely bogus for our happiness and our sanity. And it sends us sort of mad with pain. And that sends us into a sort of a spiral of well, we just look at history and see what we've done with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, I mean, we are actually more connected than we've ever been. We are more dependent on each other. You know, you just think of a sandwich that you might buy in the shop, and you really think about everything, all the people that have been involved in
Indeed.
making all the different ingredients for that sandwich and everywhere it's been and transporting it and everything. We are so interdependent, but we kind of don't, because our perspective is narrow, we don't look at that. We just see a sandwich on a shelf. So it's, yeah, and I think you're right. It's really bad for mental and physical health, actually, because it's, as we've talked about, they're entwined, but also in how just in problem solving, how we address the problems that face us and the planet, because it just makes you more narcissistic, more selfish. It sort of closes you down. You're just thinking about, well, my little bubble and my little world, if you don't have all. So we kind of need something to sort of shift us out to be thinking, no, we're all sort of we're all connected, we're all part of the same thing.
So when you are in a
Changing.
situation where that type of natural ore is not so available, let's say you're in the middle of, I don't know, some big city somewhere, and you could be in awe of the architecture maybe, or you could be in awe, you could go to a museum and look at human or natural stuff and go, wow, but it's not quite the same as being out on the tundra. So how do we integrate ore in that way when we're so removed from the source of it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think the answer is that awe is actually, for me, awe is in itself, it's a perspective, it's a way of looking at the world and a way of interacting with the world and of seeing what's incredible about the world, and just sort of, you know, looking for the connections, and there are different ways that you can do it. So one way that was suggested to me by Ron Garan, actually, astronaut, because I spoke to him about awe after experiencing the overview effect up in space, the incredible awe of seeing the
Ron Garrett, is
Ron
that?
Garan, Garan.
Garan.
How do you come back from that? Like, does normal life like just seem so boring and so tedious after that? And he was like, no, I feel more awe in life walking down the street than I ever did before. And so for him, it's all about how you look at things around you. And one of the sort of little things that he recommended was think about, so you try to look at things differently, look at things as if it's for the first time. And so one way you can do that is to think about different scales in space. So if you sort of zoom right in or zoom right out. And I ended up going on a walk in the woods with my son. He was like 11 at the time. And we were kind of looking at the trees and the moss, and then you're zooming in, like just trying to think about, wow, you know, if you were in that moss, it'd be like an incredible jungle or a forest, and what are the creatures that are like sort of crawling around. And then if you zoom down to these little mites and the cells, and realizing that, you know, everything, you know, the son was like, wow, yeah. And then we're just all made of the same stuff. Originally, he just sort of came out with that from having seen it. And now you're thinking of zooming out and how, you know, zoom out, you know, beyond the woods, and you look down on the trees and they would look a bit like the patches of moss that we've been looking at, and you zoom out. And so you can just find ways, or just thinking about different senses as well. Like, what can you see? What can you hear? What can you touch? Just
Right. So what you described was going into nature, which obviously is going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we did it by walking.
You can't, or what if you don't?
But you can take, so I have a friend, an ecologist, and she leads walks a bit like this, so often are out into nature to sort of think about all the different connections within an ecosystem and how all the different species are dependent on each other. But she ended up doing a series of walks out. It was in Tokyo, so they just went walking in the city and started with a kind of meditation about all of the different connections, and then walking out and thinking about the traffic and the sort of the streams, you know, the sort of connections and the people and the building, and how everything's moving around and how everything's connected. And she said that one of the students that was doing the walk kind of almost had a sort of transcendental experience, and said that he felt like moving down the street, he felt like a sort of blood cell in a artery. You know, he started to see the city as like a body, and all of the traffic kind of moving around like the cells through the body, and all of these sort of different connections, and just ended up seeing the city in a completely different way. So I think it's that kind of thing of just realizing how connected we are, and looking at different levels of organization But also, you can find all, as you were saying, in music or in art or in ideas, or one of the most popular sources of all, when researchers have done studies on this, one of the most popular sources of all when people have done studies on this is actually other people. So when people do things that just blow you away, like moments of kindness or sacrifice, it's those things that elevate us. That you
Right. So yeah, so could you get awe through an act of kindness, for example?
Yes, like say if somebody
yeah.
does something really nice for you, that you weren't expecting. Someone, I don't know, just buys a meal for you, or I don't know. That it's those unexpected moments. They
Is
come.
gratitude awe on a small scale?
I don't know if they're exact. I mean, I'm sure one can lead to the other. I think for awe, it needs to, like, someone can give you something expected and you're thankful for it, but awe is something that doesn't compute, that you have to, something has to shift in your brain to be able to accommodate it. So if something was kind of beyond, it expands us in a way that it's sort of be outside of our experience. But maybe gratitude can become awe if you really think about the meaning of the act. Do you know what I mean? Rather than just taking
Right.
things for granted. So so just seeing the things that other people do and allowing that to expand our world of what's possible, and therefore what we could become as well. And so it sort of elevates us to try and emulate those, the things that we see other people do. So I think that's also a really important form of awe that you can obviously see anywhere, but it involves that curiosity that you were talking about. It requires looking out and listening and being receptive and being open and being flexible. And if we're just in a safe little bubble looking down at our phone screen.
Well, I think where you were lucky and where I was lucky is that we both came from family backgrounds that encouraged that type of curiosity. My background was a little bit different, but not massively different, in that my parents were from Southern Africa, living in London, and they just encouraged curiosity. If you were into something, they'd get into it for the most part. They didn't really get into my love of death metal, but they also didn't actively oppose it. But there was this sense of curiosity as a pleasure in and of itself, to be enjoyed and savored and developed. And looking back on it, I realized how incredibly lucky I was that I received that training in appreciation, in looking for what was going to give me pleasure and please me, and putting curiosity that way, rather than a cynical or a pessimistic worldview of looking for reasons to be pissed off about stuff, or looking for reasons to not be curious about stuff, or looking for reasons to defend a particular position or so. And as a boy, of course, I took that for granted because that was just the reality. But as I got older, I realized more and more what a gift it was. I feel this should be taught in schools. I feel that there should be a class in gratitude, appreciation, or curiosity, where these things are even just suggested to children. This is a possibility. It is a possibility to think this way. Now, luckily, I think with the advent of the internet, and we're woe mongers a lot about the internet and social media, because we can obviously see a lot of the bad things. But you and I would not be having this conversation were it not for social media. You and I would not be. And what is social media but just an extension of media? It's interesting when you hear people say, "Oh, well, it's all controlled by the same few families." It's like, dude, it was always controlled by the Hearsts, or even when it was magazines and newspapers or publishing, it was always certain families. There's nothing new with any of that. But what is, I think, greater now is this choice, and, as you said, connection. So we would not be having this conversation were it not, podcasts would not exist. Yeah. So that's a product of our curiosity. So maybe curiosity is more available than it's ever been, but I still don't feel that it's
I mean, it's
available enough, if you know what I mean.
It goes both ways. With social media, it's so difficult. Like, it opens up so much and allows creativity and self-expression. And for me, starting a podcast was very much sort of felt like self-actualization, because it's the first sort of professional thing that I've done that was me just doing something. It wasn't someone else has commissioned it, someone else is paying me to do it. There's the sort of safety of that you've got an editor deciding what's going to go out. It's just, these are the people I want to talk to. This is what I want to talk about. This is the identity I want from it. And then you just do it, and it's terrifying, but also freeing, and it's amazing. But it also makes you realize how much the algorithms that all of these things are based on, that everyone is basically just trying to please the algorithm. You find out all sorts of things that, unless your social media video has got a person in it talking, the algorithm's not going to show it to anybody. And so when you look at all the popular, accounts on YouTube or whatever it is, it's just full of people like talking or doing things, and you won't be seeing beautiful photos or videos of nature, for example.
Well, you say that though. You say that, but it's funny. I was in Belgium 2 summers ago. We're Twitchers in the family, so we love to go bird watching, right? So we went to these wetlands in Belgium to see ospreys, and we didn't see any ospreys, but we saw lots of other things. When we were going past these big ponds, there was a bloke standing there with a camera, obviously filming, probably filming for some sort of, and so we stopped and talked to him, said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, all I'm doing is I'm just filming over several hours this scene and put it on YouTube." And I said, "Why would you do that?" And he said, "Because about 2 million people will look at it.
Wow.
And I make my entire living off this now."
Okay, I take it back. That sounds amazing.
So
I want to go watch that now.
yeah, totally. So we've started, interesting, we don't get 2 million views on our stuff, but we started thinking, well, that's actually not a bad idea. Why don't we just take some footage of our horses grazing in the field? Because I like to sit and look at that. And sure enough, I wasn't the only one. So although you're right, if you want to go viral in a way that you can predictably have an economic model where you could say, I, Joe Marchant, want to make my living off this podcast or something like that, get money off YouTube to do it is true that there's certain hoops that you'd be well advised to jump through. But at the same time, it also does seem that there's this funky, irrational thing where if you just kind of do whatever the fuck you want, it might also hit. And so my feeling is, why not do both? Pay some attention to the algorithm, but do exactly what you're doing, which is go just talk to the people that you're interested in.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing of like, it's really trying to stay true to the things that you want to do and that you're interested in without getting sidetracked by all that stuff that can be so
right. Because what people want, what any of us want, is authenticity, right? We'd much rather have Joe just doing something for the crack because Joe is interested in that thing, because we know that there's a certain passion and inquiry that will come out of that, than if Joe goes and does a report on Harry and Meghan because she thinks that that's what we want. I mean, you probably should do both, actually. You probably should go and do something on Harry and Meghan because it will feed your kids. But maybe you can do both. I don't know. Yeah,
well, it's always that balance, isn't it, between you've obviously got to make a living and you want people to be able to see what you're doing, but you have to stay true to the things that you were passionate about in the first place. And I think you're right. This is what we should be teaching in schools, and this is what I'm thinking about bringing up kids, is like, what skills are they going to need going forwards? And yes, I want them to study maths, and I want them to I want them to get good grades, but it's the curiosity and the creativity and the confidence and the compassion and the sort of ability to know who you are and how to follow that. I think that's the world is changing so fast. So
yes, it is.
It's got to be those things, hasn't it, that are going to be
humanity. Absolutely. As things become less human, humanity.
Well, the one thing about AI is I think it makes us focus on what do we have that's different? What are we offering that AI isn't? AI can write a book in seconds, probably.
Yes.
So it's forced me to think, well, what am I putting in my books that AI could not put in? And so it's, it's just a sort of emphasizing this, that it can't just be about summarizing information. It has to be about going out in the world and connecting with people and having experiences and going on a journey. And
integration, back to what you were saying.
Yeah, that connection, integration, that sort of human judgment and meaning. So I hope, if nothing else, AI makes us focus back on those things.
Yeah, I'm oddly optimistic about AI because the things that people seem to present to me as the apocalyptic with AI is no more than we've been doing since the advent of farming. We invented apocalypse then, and we've been doing them regularly every 25 years ever since. And there's nothing new with that. I mean, we might up the scale, but that's just business as normal. I do feel that we're actually a very loving species. And if AI is actually written by humans, love must be in there. And then might AI save us from ourselves a little bit? Might it be the thing that comes along and says, listen, children, this apocalypse thing makes no sense. Stop it now. No, we're not going to press that button to let that virus go or let all those nuclear warheads off, because that's not loving. So no, we're going to despair you at that point. I hope that that's where it's going, because in a way, if it doesn't go that way, it's irrelevant, because then we'll just all be dead, so who cares? But you know what I mean?
Yeah, I wish I was as optimistic as you about that. I mean, I love to think that AI would become this sort of wise, omniscient being that would tell us all which way to go in the world.
I don't think it will do it first. I think first it will do bad things because the people will tell it to do bad things. But I'm not sure that process will last, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's all
never
changing
surely.
so fast. And it all comes down to the choices that we make. How do we choose to interact with it and use it? And where do we choose to put our focus, and what do we choose to put our value on?
So for example, I would imagine that AI will look at this podcast, it will look at this because it's out there on the net. So maybe we can say, Mr. AI, Joe and Rue would like you very much to operate from a point of love. Could that be done? That's our challenge to you, Mr. AI. And we'd be very grateful.
Great. Well, I'm glad we sorted that.
Good. Well, we are right at the 2.5 hour mark. Thank you. You've given so much of your time. It's, and I'd like to do this again, actually, maybe when your new book comes out, and then we'll focus actually just much more on that book. But this has been a beautiful conversation. I'm grateful.
Well, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it. I didn't really know where we were going to go. So it's been great finding out.
Yeah. You've turned my attention to a lot of things which I will now go check out. Just before we go, people, let's do the book titles, the website, how people find you, how people book you, if they want you to come talk, all that good stuff, all the plugs. I'm just going to let you go. Do the plugs now.
Well, the main place to go would be my website, which is just joemarchant.com. So joemarchant.com. And that's got information about all of my books, articles, radio series, and the podcast Where the Wild Thoughts Are, which is the thing that I am the most excited about at the moment. And several of the people that I mentioned in this conversation, there's interviews with them on there. So yeah, the books we mentioned were, I've done a few, but Cure is the one about medicine and sort of mind-body relationship and the human cosmos, about our connection with the stars throughout the history of humanity. And then In Search of Now is coming out in February.
Brilliant. Okay, so perhaps come on in Feb when
amazing.
that book tour, and then let's talk about it. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much. It's been really lovely to talk to you.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. If you did, please help us to make more. Please like, subscribe, tell a friend, give us a thumbs up. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, please go to my website, rupertisaacson.com. And if you'd like to find out about our certification courses with autism, education, horsemanship, everyday shamanism, there's a whole range of cool stuff. Putting a show together like this is not an easy task. If you'd like to support us, please consider going to our Patreon page and showing us some love there. Even the smallest donation, it really helps us to keeps the good content coming. So go to rupertisaacson.com and click on the Patreon link. Not to mention our excellent merch. Please go to our shop and check out some of our really cool rock and roll themed merch, t-shirts, hoodies, all that sort of thing. rupertisaacson.com, it's all there. I can't wait for our next guest and also to meet you there. In the meantime, remember, live free, ride free.